Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to be kicking off 3 professional trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training begins January 6th, 2023. This Level 1 training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. The Level 2 trainings will be offered in person in the San Francisco Bay Area beginning January 2023 and in an online format beginning February 2023. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. Laura Reagan, LCSWC, is an integrative trauma therapist, consultant, and coach who owns a group practice outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2015, Laura has hosted Therapy Chat podcast, and in 2021, she founded the Trauma Therapist Network, a resource to share information about trauma and help people locate a trauma therapist in their area. Laura is passionate about spreading the message that trauma is real, healing is possible, and help is available. Please enjoy my conversation with Laura Reagan. Okay, I'm sitting here with Laura Reagan. Welcome to the podcast. We're so happy to have you on Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here.
Yeah, so I'm happy to have this time together to connect with you and talk about the work you're doing. And I'd love to start with asking you a question that we ask all of our guests here on Transforming Trauma. What would you like listeners to get out of our time together today?
That's a wonderful question and a great therapy starting question. I think what I want people to get out of our time is to consider ways that trauma might be showing up in their lives that isn't exactly what they might have thought of when they think of trauma, because I think trauma is super prevalent. We all know that. And it's very common in clients who come through our offices as therapists, but I think it's very common in therapists as well. And we often sort of look at it as, we don't really have trauma when we usually do. And the ways that it can sneak up on us can really interfere with therapy, for one thing.
Right.
And interfere with our own well-being as we're doing the work. So I think that that's the piece that I hope people will be able to reflect about when we finish.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in the field.
Sure. I have many hats I wear. Yeah. So I own a group practice, and I recently stopped working with clients directly, not necessarily forever, but for the near future. And so I have 2 clinicians who work with me in my practice right now, and we specialize in complex trauma and serve people throughout the state of Maryland. And I also have Therapy Chat podcast, which is a way that I try to help therapists learn that there are so many different ways of working with trauma aside from the top-down medical model that we typically learn about in school. And then I started Trauma Therapist Network, which is a website where people can learn about trauma. And again, I think there are a lot of people who need trauma therapy right now, but they may be looking for therapy, not knowing that specialized trauma therapy would be the most beneficial thing for them. So it's a website to help people learn about trauma and kind of help recognize how it might be showing up in our lives in ways that we don't always pick up on.
Yeah.
And it's also a support community for therapists. So we learn trauma treatment methods. Brad Kammer was a guest on Therapy Chat last week, and he's coming next week to our community to teach them a little bit about NARM. So I think everything I'm doing is with a goal to help more people find healing and deep, real healing, and not just surface Band-Aid work.
Yeah. That's so, so important. I really appreciate. I mentioned how I've been listening to your podcast for a long time, and I've learned from your guests and from the way that you hold the container that you're talking about and the group that you have, this community that you've built of therapists. It's so amazing to be able to connect with others doing this work too. So that's so valuable. So I just wanted to highlight that. If you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this work, what led you to working with complex trauma and even just getting into the field.
Yeah, I would love to. I love my story of how I got into this work. I started out, I think actually this story is kind of a metaphor for what I'm talking about with how we don't recognize that we have our own trauma.
Yeah.
I had a very winding path to becoming a clinician, and I had a very tumultuous teenage life and my early teens or my early adulthood too. It was a very twisted, a lot of missteps and pain and hardships. And so by the time I was about 22, I had half of my bachelor's degree, and I had stopped going to school because I was supporting myself and I couldn't afford it. And, I had a minimum wage job. And so I met my husband, and he was finishing up his degree in psychology, his undergraduate degree, and kind of inspired me to go back to school. And when I did, I was like, well, what do I want to be? I don't know. I want to help people. And so I decided to major in sociology. And in that program, what I was so interested in is basically what drives behavior. Why do people do what they do, and why do the problems of our culture happen? Why do people do drugs? Why do people commit crimes?
Right.
Why do bad things happen? Basically. So my husband was like, well, I'm getting my undergraduate degree in psychology, and I didn't do any internships, and I'm working in a furniture store. So basically, if you want to get a job in the field and even to get into grad school, you're going to need to do some kind of internship or something. So I was like, what could I do? So I passed by our local YWCA, and I saw their marquee said volunteers wanted. So I called them and I said, hi, I'm interested in finding out about your volunteer stuff. And they said, okay, it's a hotline position for our sexual assault crisis center. Is that what you had in mind? And I was like, what? I didn't even know that existed, or that really like sexual assault was kind of a thing that people would be seeking support with. Because I really wasn't in tune with the field at all. And this was in the early 2000s. So long story short, I went to their training, started doing hospital accompaniment and answering the hotline. And through their training, which was very trauma informed, surprisingly, in 2002.
Oh, wow.
With a lot of teachings from Bruce Perry's work with child brain development and, within the environment of trauma. And Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, was one of the things that we read to understand. So, yeah, it was like,
that's incredible.
Yeah, I was lucky to kind of get the complex trauma, chronic PTSD perspective from the beginning, as the way that my learning about this work and abuse and childhood trauma, all of that, having that baked in early was very fortunate for me. And I mean, the internet wasn't really what it is now.
Yeah, it was dial up back then, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it wasn't like you could do online courses and all these trainings and stuff. So, but there were certain things that really would stick with me. There were certain experiences that our clients would have that I was just like, I would really be overwhelmed with pain at recognizing how unjust these things were. And I didn't realize it then, but that was where my trauma wounds were getting activated as I was working with these clients. So, I really didn't have an awareness of having trauma myself. So I'm working towards my undergrad degree with plans to go to grad school. And I go to my university counseling center and say, hey, I want to become a therapist. And I heard that I should get counseling and kind of figure out what my issues are. So here I am. And they were like, okay, so what do you want to work on? And I was like, finding out what my issues are. And they were like, well, what do you think they might be? And I was like, I don't know. I have no idea. No idea. Mm-hmm. So I think it's funny because that was almost 20 years ago when I sought out therapy. And I laughed because I have so many issues I've been working on in therapy for so long. And it's like, I literally just did not know that these things were affecting me. And if I had gone into the field then without doing therapy, oh my gosh, I can't imagine what harm I would have done because I really would have been very blind to a lot of things. So
I'm curious where you got that message. Who was it that told you, hey, it might be a good idea for you to go to therapy beforehand?
Yeah. I think the first place it came from was my supervisor at the Sexual Assault Crisis Center. She literally said, we all have mother issues here. Do you have mother issues? And I was like, well, I don't think so. And she was like, well, you probably do. And you'll find out when your clients trigger them in you. And I was like, interesting. It's total mystery. But like my parents got divorced when I was 6 and my mom left. So do I have mommy issues? Yes, I do. So,
and it hadn't occurred to you.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Thanks for normalizing that.
So that's sort of like when I think about complex trauma, it sounds complex, but when you have it and you don't know, it doesn't feel complex because you're just like, what? There's nothing.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Is just the water I'm swimming in. I don't know.
Yeah. But then once you start, exploring, you find out, things that I thought were maybe like personality traits of mine are actually just reactions to trauma or adaptations that developed because I couldn't tolerate something. So I, brilliantly, my brain put up a structure to make sure that I didn't have to feel that for a long time. But then it's also that beautiful clarity where it's like, these underlying things are driving why I behave the way I do. And things that I don't understand about myself now make sense. And I don't have to relate from that place now that I know.
Right. Yeah. It's like once our eyes are open to it, then we have choices. Before our eyes are open to it, we don't even know any difference. So there is really no choice. So I love what you're highlighting there of when we discover it, then we can use our agency and move through, however we decide. So
yeah.
You were working in the volunteer position, and where did that take you?
Well, I worked as a volunteer for 1.5 years, and then I started working there full time as an employee. So I was there altogether almost 4 years. And then my husband, inspired by me going back to school, went back to school and he started working on his PhD. So then we moved to DC area where we live now so that he could start working in DC. And we were in Virginia. So we were about 4 hours away from DC. Now we're about an hour away. But anyway, we moved up here and I took another position at a sexual assault crisis center. And, I would have these moments where I would be so passionate, so devoted, so focused on the work. And then something would happen where I would like crash. It was like, I don't know if it would fit burnout, but it was definitely having a trauma reaction that, became overwhelming and caused me to have to say, let me reevaluate what's happening here. And often in our field, there's so many unsupportive agency environments and things like that, on-call demands, things that really tax our inner resources. And then maybe something in our personal life comes along that adds to our emotional burden. And that's when we just are like, I can't take this.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I never wanted to leave the field. I guess I mentioned that because those were kind of like indications that I was really being affected negatively by the work. I was the only one really noticing it or concerned about it, so I had to sort of just look out for myself with it instead of having the supervision to be, mentored and guided more, like, to understand what was happening.
In many ways, it looked maybe from the outside, no one would perceive you as like that you're functioning at a lower, like you were just showing up and doing the stuff, but internally your experience was something's wrong.
Yeah. I was really pushing through.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure people could see that my work was, or my emotional capacity was suffering, but it wasn't getting through why. I think that's what it was. And there wasn't, like when I worked in the program in Virginia and this happened, there was one client that I worked with who had a really violent experience, and it was just the most violent thing I've ever witnessed, being with the person face to face to see how they were physically harmed. And it was very horrifying for me, and it made me just feel so much despair and hopelessness. And that supervisor, who was the same one that asked me if I had mommy issues, she saw what was going on. She was like, I want you to take some time off. You just need to rest. It's okay. And I was like, no, I can't cancel with people. But, and I was feeling more like overly responsible, and which are some of the indications when things aren't going well. You start to feel like you should be doing more instead of realizing that you need to do more for yourself.
Less.
Yeah. But then later in some of the other agencies I worked in, it was less of a supportive relationship with the supervisor and less of an awareness of trauma. So that was, I think the difference was that my first supervisor knew about trauma. So she could see when the trauma reaction was happening. That's what I was going through, and respond very compassionately, where the other places with people who didn't understand trauma, they couldn't point it out to me, and I wasn't seeing it because I was in the reaction. So,
right.
I was just kind of like, I got to get out of this job. And so I did that and went to a more supportive place. And when we moved up here, that's when I went to grad school. And it still wasn't trauma informed, my program or anything, but that was the perspective that I had. So I just used that to explore for myself and, focused on trauma focused interventions and things like that. Then I've worked in like hospitals, and I've worked in a variety of places, but my passion has always been to work with people who've experienced childhood abuse, because I think it's so prevalent, and violence in the world of children is so prevalent, even if it's not framed as abusive, because in a lot of places it may be perfectly legal and acceptable to hit children. But, when an attachment caregiver is physically hurting them, that's not safe. It's traumatic.
It's traumatic. Yeah.
And it's attachment trauma too.
Right. So you've been passionate about that since the beginning. And so that was kind of always the lens I'm hearing as you moved through your education, that you always kind of used that lens, that foundation that I heard you got at that very first volunteer position. That's so wonderful.
Yeah, I was really lucky.
So that's what brought you into the field. And then so you went on to grad school and got your LCSWC.
Yeah.
And now you said you run an agency and you have this podcast and a community that you run. So I imagine you have lots of opportunities in working with other clinicians and clients and the people in the spaces that you've created. I wonder if you have any, stories that you'd like to share with us, or that you'd feel comfortable sharing, just in terms of, struggle or, ways folks have navigated and come on the other side. I'm so curious what you've learned.
Sure. Well, I love helping therapists become more skilled in trauma work, trauma and attachment. When I say trauma, I'm really referring to trauma and attachment. But I think that when you learn about trauma, and especially complex trauma, because complex trauma clients are often the ones who come in appearing very high functioning. So when we hear complex trauma, we think people who are very disorganized, people who are struggling in multiple areas of their lives. And that can certainly be true, but there are so many people with complex trauma who are really doing everything outwardly in their lives. Everything's going pretty well. Usually it's internally. They feel, a lot of self-loathing and, shame. And so I love helping therapists learn about that. I love helping therapists explore their own inner worlds to have the most access to their highest selves to bring to the work. Because again, I feel like it's important that where our blind spots are our pain spots, So we can be very blind to what it's like for our clients, and we can miss important opportunities for healing, or we can relationally reenact, those abusive patterns even through our lack of self-awareness. So I just feel like that's really important. So I'll tell you one story, which is about me again, that when I started doing that therapy way back in the 2000s, as I was trying to get tuned into what was going on inside me, I remember one time I was writing, one of those write a letter to your mom that you're not going to send, where you say whatever you want to say. So I was writing that and I had tears streaming down my face, and I literally touched my face and was like, why does my face feel wet? I don't feel sad.
Oh, wow.
So it was like this disconnect between, I was having the emotional reaction, but I wasn't feeling the emotion. And that's when I realized how we can be so
cut off,
disconnected between body and mind. So somatic practices, movement, expressive arts, anything that gets you more mindfully in touch with what's happening in the body, I feel like those ways are a must in working with, especially complex trauma, because there's so much pre-verbal, early wounding that can only be expressed through accessing the body.
I love that. You're talking about the wisdom in many cultures. I think in Western, society, we're so disconnected from a lot of those wise ways of using the body to process through our experiences. And so it's always exciting to hear when, someone is utilizing that in the work, and clearly you're doing that as well. So I'm wondering, for you in that moment when you touched your face and you're like, why is my face wet? I mean, did you have a sense, or was it kind of later looking back, you're like, oh, that's what that was? Or, I'm curious for you in that moment, what that was like for you.
Yeah. In that moment, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so weird. Why? I'm crying. My face is wet. I'm crying, and I don't feel like I'm sad or crying. So, if I were to look back on that now, I would almost say that could be like depersonalization,
Oh,
I never really had that symptom or related to it. But if something is happening in your body and you're not connected with that, it's coming from you, but you're you, that's kind of how people describe it. So yeah, it was like a crashing coming together of, actually, I think I was feeling anger. I felt connected to anger, but not hurt. And so it was like this,
Oh, interesting.
Why are these tears coming? I don't feel sad, but my face is wet. Let me really get honest. I was writing it and I looked in the paper, had like drops of water on it. And I go,
Yeah.
where's that coming from? And that's when I touched my face.
That's when you realize, just seeing it.
Wow, this whole thing can be going on in here. And you can really, in your cognitive brain, just not know.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And kind of like you pointed to earlier, it's a brilliant way that we've adapted in these ways when we realize how cut off we are, that it was so painful, especially as young people. That's overwhelming. So we cut off from it. It's really a brilliant adaptation. And as an adult, you're like, wait a second, there's something deeper going on here.
Yeah. And I think when you feel disconnected from an experience of like victimization or something where you felt so powerless, then I think what happens for a lot of us, and I guess development plays a role here. It depends on sort of your age when things happened and how you began to find a different way to cope from the way that, might have been ideal. if that wasn't accessible to you. It's like there's shame. I think for me, it's like all these things that are in that space of, I can't know this because it would be too much for my system if I did. There's a lot of shame there too. It's like those are like pieces of information that confirm that I'm like not lovable or that I'm bad or unworthy in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So then instead of, at least for me, but I've seen this with my clients too, instead of recognizing that the feelings of being bad or unlovable are actually protecting you from knowing what happened, it's actually, you think, oh, say mom left and that's because she didn't love me, I'm not lovable. You know, that's like a child's interpretation of the situation. But instead of accessing the pain of what that really felt like, it's more like a thought of, you know, I'm bad because this, I'm bad because that, I'm bad because I look like this, or I don't look like this, or I behave this way, you know, making up these, like they say, your cognitive mind makes up a story of why. Right.
To make sense of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, as you start to see what's in there and how, oh, of course I felt that way because I was little and I didn't understand what was happening and I was losing my attachment figure, who I needed.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't want that to be true. So instead I made up, you know, an explanation that was really painful, but not as bad as what that would have felt like then, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a beautiful opportunity to realize that all of those negative beliefs about yourself are just things that you made up because it made you feel better in a way.
Well, and I'm just thinking you would have felt like I had some control.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
Like if it was that I was bad, then at least I'm in control of that and maybe I could change it if at some point I wanted to.
Exactly. If I could do better, then it wouldn't happen again.
Yeah, and that's not as frightening as like my caregiver just left. Like who's going to take care of me? There's a whole void now.
Yeah.
There for me. At least I can feel some power in that. Well, I must have made this happen. So that makes so much sense. Yeah.
And I mean, even like we might learn that, but I think when you experience that knowing from within yourself,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, oh, and then you can, I think, work with it differently with clients too.
Right.
Because you can really sort of feel that like complexity, not to overuse the word, but you know, there's so much like tied together to be untangled and uncoupled and
Mm-hmm. But that felt sense really
yes,
like anchors you into something deeper than the cognitive knowing. Because how many times have we like told ourselves, well, of course I knew.
yep.
I love that scene. You've probably seen the movie Good Will Hunting. That scene where Robin Williams is telling Matt Damon's character, it wasn't your fault.
So painful.
Anyway, I love that scene in the movie because cognitively he knew, yeah, I know I was a kid. I know I was a kid. But he had that message that it wasn't his fault had never really landed in a felt sense way that I'm hearing you talk about. And
Yes.
how powerful that is when it does land, what that means, because it opens up this whole other space of, well, now that this isn't true, I'm realizing this is true, that it wasn't my fault. And now from an adult place, how do I meet that? Or what do I do with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just hearing you name. That's so beautiful. So you had that experience. So was it when you were writing the letter? And this is personal, so
That's okay.
obviously you don't want to answer the question. But I'm just curious for you, when you're working with clients, like is that something you kind of refer to internally of, can you see when there's that felt sense experience?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think so when you're working with clients and you're giving them, it's kind of a cognitive task to write that letter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, you're engaging your creative brain too because you're writing and you're connecting with your emotion. But, you know, write a letter to your mom, letting her know everything. If you didn't have to worry about what she would say back, you know, what would you want to say to her? That can be very cathartic. And it can, I think, be flooding too, you know? So I think where the therapist's felt sense of their own experiences really is important is that if you're really tuned into yourself, it's like your body is picking up from their body it's not just the like nonverbals. Oh, I see you touched your eye, so maybe it means something. But it's like there's a reading from body to body, just like it makes sense when I think about like dogs walking up to each other and sniffing each other. And like, oh, you're you. Oh, but for us, we're like, I only know what I see here and what's written down. And, so it's like getting those barriers that you have to your own knowing about your own pain out of the way. So that means, not being so disconnected from your own experiences of pain. Obviously, you don't want to be in your own pain during your session with your clients, but if you're in tune enough with your own experiences and reactions, at worst, you can say, something's happening for me. And at best, you get like clear, like information. It comes from your body. It's like your wisdom tells you something. And so it's like intuition, and I don't know.
I love it. No, I'm resonating with this. I think of it like if you've ever seen a stringed instrument where you play one string and the other string vibrates because it's like resonating. That's like the image that I get when you're talking of like you just feel something in your body, and not that we're diving into our own experience or going to go there. In NARM, we talk about it like the 50-50. So I'm here and I'm present with you, but I'm feeling it in my own body too. And what you said totally makes sense to me. I love that. So as a clinician, that's what you're able to tune in to your own experience while you're holding the space with the client. And
and it's slow. It slows things down. And, they say slow is fast in trauma therapy. And when you're in a traumatic experience, time feels different too. So it's like if you're having a reenactment with your client where you don't know that you hate yourself because your mom left, and they are talking about how they hate themselves because their mom left, and you're either going to abandon them like their mom did, or you're going to like, become overbearing, do something, somehow you're going to play out with them, that dynamic. But if you do know that you used to hate yourself because your mom left, or that sometimes you're really hard on yourself because your mom left, and you can understand how nuanced that can be and how it can feel and how confusing it is and all of those complexities, when you're with the client and you're tuned into yourself, you don't have to dissociate from your own experience to be present with them and theirs. Then, it's whatever the opposite of a reenactment would be that, there's like a synchrony between the two bodies, and you're able to help them interregulation, co-regulation. So yeah, I guess basically it would be simple as thinking about it as if you're disconnected from your own experience, then you're dysregulated while they're talking about their thing. And then from your dysregulated place, you don't know you're dysregulated because you're dissociated from it. They're feeling not heard, not attuned, and they probably can't put that into words either, but it'll come out in some other way. Which is what's so fascinating about attachment, right?
Yeah, it's amazing, really, how unconsciously all these things can be coming up and we're not even aware if we haven't done that work. And so how vital it is, really, for us to do the self of the therapist piece, because it can come up. I'm just thinking about how it can be a tool, like you're naming. Like if we're aware of it, it actually can work in our favor that we've had this experience. Of course, we can be attuned to them. But if we're pushing it away because we haven't, done that work yet, it can be damaging. And I've had my own experience of that.
As a client or a therapist?
As both, actually. Before I became more trauma informed, I had a situation that now I look back and I think, wow, I was really unaware of what was happening. I didn't, kind of like you named, I didn't even know the work was there to be done. I was very unaware of it. And now looking back, I can know. But I also have an experience in my early 20s with a therapist that it was really painful. Yeah.
I'm sorry that you went through that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And also it's not really about like blaming ourselves for what we didn't know, or, feeling shame about whatever's unhealed and unresolved. I think that there's a positive movement happening of therapists being more humanistic and more, using the fact that, how did we get good at caring so much about other people selflessly. There's a way that happened.
Right.
I say this all the time, but it's like for nurses, therapists, police officers, firefighters, everyone has their own origin story of how they became a helping professional. And I think that therapists tend to be more the ones who were like the parentified child, because we're really good at just like disappearing in service to the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's almost like a childhood trauma profile that you could kind of look at who did what,
Mm-hmm.
what you chose to become based on
Yeah.
what happened when you were younger.
Yeah. If we were the parentified child, then going into a helping profession makes a lot of sense. We're really good at that.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
So our wounds can be gifts in our work. And honestly, if we looked at them any other way, you'd have to wonder, how open are we to our clients if we judge ourselves for having past experiences of abuse, loss, grief, victimization?
That's so interesting you said that. I think every therapist should go into therapy. So, what it's like to be on the other side, if nothing else, than to understand what that's like to be on the other side. But
yeah, I know. I call that the methinks thou dost protest too much. I've never needed therapy. No, not me. No. It's like, okay. That's lucky for you.
Yeah.
Good thing.
That's unheard of. That's good. I'm glad that worked out for you.
Yeah.
I know we're coming up on our time here, but I wanted to check in and just see, is there anything else that you've learned, either in your process and in process with clients about complex trauma that's really helped you and that you would like others to know?
I guess, this isn't necessarily much additional to what I've already said, but I think just please be gentle with yourselves. That's what I want to say, because it is a really hard world and we don't have to do violence to ourselves and hopefully not to others.
Be gentle with ourselves. That's a beautiful way to close. Thank you so much. Obviously, you have your podcast that others can find you on. So Laura, thank you so much. We're just so grateful that you came to share your time with us. And I wondered if there's any other things that you would like to share in the work that you're doing that you'd like us to know.
Sure. Well, basically, traumatherapistnetwork.com is the website where my 2 podcasts, Therapy Chat and Trauma Chat, live. And there are blog posts there and has a searchable directory. And it's also a community for trauma therapists. So it's a membership community for therapists who need more support to combat the isolation of trauma work. And we have self-care calls, case consultation, Q&As, and trainings every month. So I'd like to offer your audience a discount of 20% off their first month using the code TTNSAVE20.
They'll be able to find that on your website or on the...
Yeah, so they would just go to go.traumatherapistnetwork.com/register.
Cool. Awesome. That's so generous of you. Thank you.
So that's where everything I'm focusing on right now is found. I do have my practice website, but that's just for people in Maryland, but it's bahealing.com.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So folks know how to get a hold of you on your podcasts and in the work that you're doing. And we'll put those links in the show notes. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off 3 professional trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 Online NARM Basics Training begins January 6, 2023. This Level 1 training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist Training. The Level 2 trainings will be offered in person in the San Francisco Bay Area beginning January 2023 and in an online format beginning February 2023. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.